Muchas gracias. También se encuentra en idioma español e inglés. La hoja de ruta es un documento estratégico aspiracional y de carácter voluntario que plantea ciertos objetivos y metas a mediano y largo plazo para transitar hacia edificios cero emisiones como práctica de construcción común en México. Este webinar es organizado por la Agencia Internacional de Energía con el valioso apoyo de la SENER. Mi nombre es Ana Lepure, consultora de la agencia en México, y tendré el gusto de moderar la sesión. Hoy me acompañan David Morgado, analista de energía, y Brian Dean, especialista en edificaciones, ambos del programa de eficiencia energética en economías emergentes de la agencia, y quienes serán los presentadores del día de hoy. El webinar será impartido en idioma inglés, pero pueden enviar sus preguntas y comentarios en español. Muy bien, la agenda del día de hoy. Tenemos esta breve introducción y después escucharemos unas palabras de bienvenida por Gabriela Reyes, directora de Aprovechamiento Sustentable de la Energía en SENER. Entrando de lleno a la sesión, se presentará el panorama general del consumo de energía en el sector de las edificaciones a nivel global y en México, la necesidad de una hoja de ruta, los objetivos y metas establecidas, así como una lista de actores relevantes de quien depende la consecución de las metas planteadas. Se ahondará en el contenido de la hoja de ruta enfocándose en los 5 principales temas: desarrollo, adopción, implementación, revisión y comunicación y fortalecimiento de capacidades, cerrando con algunos pasos a seguir. Al final, esperamos tener tiempo para preguntas y respuestas. Nos gustaría mucho escucharlos e incluirlos de una forma más activa en la sesión, así que por favor hagan preguntas y compartan sus comentarios, así podremos discutirlos al final del webinar en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Para ello, antes de iniciar el webinar, nos gustaría comentar algunos aspectos de la configuración del webinar y mostrar cómo pueden participar en la sesión de hoy. La diapositiva muestra un ejemplo de la interfaz de la plataforma. Deberían de estar viendo algo similar en su computadora. Por default, ustedes se han unido al webinar de hoy escuchando por los altavoces de su computadora. Esto significa que si por lo general puede escuchar música en su computadora, usted será capaz de escuchar la presentación. Si desea llamar utilizando el teléfono, localice su panel de audio en la pantalla y seleccione Usar teléfono. Enseguida se mostrará la información de acceso telefónico y el código de acceso. El número y código de acceso se indican en esta diapositiva. También tiene la posibilidad de hacer preguntas usando su panel de preguntas. Simplemente ingrese su pregunta en inglés o español y haga clic en enviar. Al final de la presentación vamos a dar tiempo para la discusión y contestar las preguntas que se hayan realizado durante la presentación. Tome en cuenta que estaremos grabando el webinar y lo subiremos a nuestro canal de YouTube para aquellos que se han perdido la sesión de hoy o por si desea compartirlo con colegas o le gustaría verlo de nuevo. ¿Tenemos alguna pregunta hasta este momento? De no ser así, procederemos a las palabras de bienvenida de la licenciada Gabriela Reyes, directora de Aprovechamiento Sustentable de la Energía en la SENER. Gaby.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días a todos. Por parte de la Secretaría de Energía, me permito agradecer su atención a este webinar, atención a la convocatoria y darles, por supuesto, la más cordial bienvenida. Bienvenidos a este webinar sobre la presentación de la hoja de ruta en materia de edificaciones para México. Antes de iniciar, me permito agradecer una vez más a la Agencia Internacional de Energía por todo el apoyo que nos brinda de manera continua desde hace ya un par de meses, años ya, podemos hablar de la realización de estos espacios de diálogo y discusión. El tema que hoy nos ocupa hace referencia a la construcción de una hoja de ruta para México en materia de códigos y normas de eficiencia energética, como bien se mencionaba, que tiene como fundamento principal nuestra Ley de Transición Energética publicada en el 2015 y específicamente se encuentra referenciada en las políticas y líneas de acción del apartado de edificaciones que establece la estrategia de transición para promover el uso de tecnologías y combustibles más limpios. Asimismo, esta hoja de ruta ha sido el resultado de un trabajo conjunto propiciado inicialmente por la Agencia Internacional de Energía y en acompañamiento con la Comisión Nacional para el Uso Eficiente de la Energía, la CONUEE, entre otras agencias e instituciones como el INEC, el Instituto Nacional de Cambio Climático, la Agencia Danesa de Energía, la Agencia Alemana para el Desarrollo, calidad y sustentabilidad en la edificación CACEDI, WRI México y cerca de 65 actores y expertos que nos apoyaron con sus opiniones en la materia. Finalmente, esperamos que el contenido y los resultados de este trabajo propicien el diálogo y la reflexión, así como también nos permitan concentrar, difundir y direccionar todos los esfuerzos que ya se han realizado en esta materia, tanto nacionales como locales, y que nos permitan hacer de nuestras edificaciones más eficientes en materia de energía. Muchísimas gracias y bienvenidos nuevamente.
Muchas gracias, Gaby, por tus palabras y sobre todo por el apoyo, no nada más de la realización de estos webinars, sino también por todo el apoyo en la elaboración de esta hoja de ruta. Bueno, ahora paso la palabra a mi colega Brian Dean para iniciar la sesión del día de hoy. Brian.
Okay. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Gabby, and thank you to SENER for the support, of course, with this webinar and this great work that we're doing on buildings for Mexico. So as we start thinking through why we're doing building energy codes and standards for Mexico, we want to start by thinking about how is energy being used. And so we've got a couple of slides here where we talk about energy use globally and in Mexico specifically. And of course what we see is that globally energy use in buildings has increased significantly over time. And we have found that in jurisdictions that have adopted building energy codes that they've started to level off and even seen decreasing energy use per floor area of building. But globally we still do see that there's significant growth in particular in space cooling and in appliances. And you'll see that basically heating, both space heating and water heating levels off, and so does lighting. And so with each of these, we think, okay, globally, it's quite important to do building energy codes and standards. Now, when we're talking about Mexico, we see that there's a slightly different trend in that, of course, space heating is not a significant energy use, but water heating is. Both lighting and space cooling have been increasing, as has the appliance and cooking. So into the future, what are we expecting, and how can we potentially impact the energy use globally? So in Mexico, we see that actually the space heating likely is leveling off. However, we do still see growth in water heating. Lighting basically levels off because of the new LED and CFL lighting technologies. But space cooling, you can see, has a significant growth expected between now and 2050, as is appliance and cooking. So these are significant areas of potential energy savings in the building energy codes. Now I'm going to turn it over to David to have him talk about why do a roadmap.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Anna, as well, for the introduction, as well as Gabby. As mentioned by Brian, energy consumption in the building sector is likely to increase significantly until 2050, and therefore it's critical to address this through several energy efficiency measures, and more importantly, through the adoption and enforcement of building energy codes and standards, which currently face several challenges in Mexico, as many of you might be aware of. In the next couple of slides, I'll explain why SENER and CONUEE, with the support of the International Energy Agency, have developed this roadmap for building energy codes and standards. So let's start with an important aspect, which is the energy efficiency and its multiple benefits. Energy efficiency can contribute to economic and social development, and this is very important to be highlighted to both federal and local government policymakers in Mexico in order to secure their interest and support in improving energy efficiency in all sectors. And we carried out a consultation with several stakeholders, and they mentioned that this was a key step to get both federal and local governments on board. Energy efficiency offers multiple benefits, as shown in the flower in the slide, as you see there. And the building sector in Mexico can benefit from energy efficiency measures, including improvement of thermal comfort and reduction in household medical bills due to better insulation, improved property values from improved building quality and reduced operational costs, and reduced peak demand loads on the electricity grid. Our publication called Capturing the Multiple Benefits of Energy Efficiency, which is available online for free, covers all these benefits in more detail and includes some case studies. In Mexico, a number of existing programs and standards have already set the groundwork for increasing energy efficiency in the building sector. And these include the energy efficiency standards, Normas Oficial Mexicanas, the NOMS, which are available for appliances and lighting since the 90s, the Sustainable Housing Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions, so the Sustainable Housing NAMAS program, which has been quite successful. As many of you have heard, the Eco Casa program, particularly focusing on social housing, and as well as the FIPA-TERM program looked at insulation, particularly in Mexicali. That's the Fideicomiso para Aislamiento Térmico de la Vivienda. And finally, several energy efficient appliance replacement programs that have been done in conjunction with the FIDE and as well as with the World Bank and others. Sorry. So what is a roadmap? The general aim of a roadmap is to provide a common vision and guidance to all stakeholders on how energy use in the building sector is expected to evolve in a certain time period, and what are the key actions that will help achieve the targets set in the roadmap in alignment with national policies and goals. As you can see there on the slide, the words highlight some of the key words that reflect what the roadmap is meant for, so to provide guidance, reference, actions, and to be pretty much a strategic and collaborative document. What was the objective of this roadmap concretely? So it can be broken down into three main objectives. First of all, help stimulate greater collaboration between federal and local governments, as well as other key stakeholders in building market confidence and providing a long-term strategy for energy efficiency in buildings. Secondly, help provide consistency, commitment, clarity, and long-term stability in policies to promote energy efficiency in buildings. And thirdly and finally, to secure an agreement with the building industry and other interested entities on the future of energy efficiency for new and existing buildings, and help establish a sustainable and efficient building industry and market in Mexico. Overall, in order to be an effective roadmap, it will require joint effort from all the key stakeholders in the sector, federal government, state and local governments, building industry, academia, amongst others, and we'll cover those in more detail up ahead. So how was it developed? It was led by SENER and CONUEE with the support from the International Energy Agency, and we did this in collaboration with several expert organizations, including the CACEDI, CONAVI, the Danish Energy Agency, the GIZ, INEC, ONCE, and WRI. In November 2016, we held a consultation workshop with several experts and agencies in Mexico City to present and discuss the first draft of the roadmap and also gather some feedback. We incorporated the feedback received and shared the roadmap again with all stakeholders for a final review at the end of the last year. And on the 30th of March, the roadmap was formally launched by SENER and CONUEE. So what is the roadmap about? In this slide, I will highlight the four main stages of governance to the development, implementation, and improvement of building energy codes in Mexico. Each state has different key stakeholders that play a leading role, yet all stages require a coordinated effort between federal and local governments. We'll be speaking about each of the four stages in more detail in this webinar, therefore I'll just briefly highlight each of the four parts of this wheel. So the first part, plan and development, is led by the federal government in order to set minimum building energy codes and standards in consultation with key stakeholders. The second point, as you see there, adoption and adaptation, After the Building Energy Code has been developed, a key step is to have the local government adopt the Building Energy Code and, if necessary, adapt it to local characteristics, local climate, and existing legal framework. Thirdly, enforcement and certification. Once the Building Energy Code is developed, adapted, and adopted, enforcement is critical. This step is led by the local government and involves participation of qualified experts in building energy analysis, inspection, and enforcement. And finally, the fourth part. Regular review and update of building energy codes is essential to trigger the market to continue to innovate and move to higher efficiency levels. This process is again led by the federal government. And so as you can see here, all the key stakeholders that need to be involved, as well as the process that is used to assess, develop, and improve and implement the Building Energy Code. The main challenge, however, is this wheel is not turning, and therefore the need for this roadmap and concrete actions. So who needs to be involved to get this wheel to turn? While doing the roadmap, we identified a total of at least 65 relevant stakeholders in the buildings, equipment, and appliance sector, as we'll show in this slide, and that need to be involved in the roadmap. We divided them into 4 main groups, that is federal government, local governments, building industry, and stakeholders and others. So you can see here there's a big list of federal governments, local governments as well, several associations, municipal associations need to be involved. The building industry stakeholders, again, many associations and institutes need to be involved. And then finally, a number of other stakeholders, including international organizations. The roadmap document sets specific actions for many of these stakeholders, and we're hoping that many of you that are attending the webinar today can help us disseminate and implement this roadmap and take forward many of these actions. So you're probably wondering, where can I find the roadmap so I can read it in more detail. As mentioned by Anna, the roadmap was formally launched by SENER and CONUEE on the 30th of March 2017, and you can see the main roadmap document shown on the left, and it's got it's about a 30-page document, and it's available in both English and Spanish on the SENER's and CONUEE's website in the link mentioned in the slide. We'll be sharing these slides with you soon after this presentation, so don't worry, you'll have that link available to you. Then we also produced a roadmap summary shown on the right, which comprises of just 2 pages, which is also available on SENER and CONUEE's website. And the aim here is to highlight the main actions and targets set under the roadmap, and it makes it very easy to read and to pass on to local policymakers and federal government. Overall, we're quite proud of this document. Mexico is now one of the few countries in the world to have a roadmap for building energy codes and standards. And if it's effectively implemented, we're hoping this experience and roadmap can be adopted and replicated in other emerging economies which have similar challenges, such as Brazil and Indonesia. So I'll pass on to Brian to talk about goals and targets.
So the roadmap sets a series of goals, both realistic and aspirational, that are meant to support the energy transition law and the transition strategy to promote the use of cleaner technologies and fuels. For example, the transition strategy to promote the use of cleaner technologies and fuels, electricity consumption is expected to decrease by 53% in residential buildings and decrease by 79% in the commercial building sector by 2050. So working those goals into the roadmap has been quite important. In terms of the aspirational goals, we've looked at it over 3 different periods, and by 2020, one of the aspirational goals is that an advanced stretch code that offers additional energy savings to jurisdictions or builders is developed. and that by 2030, an aspirational goal is that all states and capital cities adopt and effectively enforce a building energy code, and that by 2050, net zero emission buildings are commonly built across Mexico. These proposed goals and targets can be achieved through the implementations of the actions detailed in the slides ahead, noting that a greater commitment by local governments will be critical to make this possible. So for the actual specific targets, the roadmap breaks it down in the same areas that David mentioned, the development, adoption, enforcement, review, and update, plus the capacity building and communications. The key targets are set out both in the short, medium, and long term, and as you can see, the capacity building short term is to increase the awareness of the building energy codes and to train cities at a basic level. And then over the medium and long term, working towards capacity building towards net zero emission buildings. For development in the short term, having the 2015 National Model Code that has already been developed, and then building on top of that with additional continuous development of the building code, including a stretch code by 2020, and then continuous evolution of both the National Model Code and continuous evolution of the stretch code, such that by 2050, the model code could be 50% more efficient than the current model code, and that the stretch code could be net zero energy or net zero emission buildings. On the adoption side, the goal is in the short term to have 5 states adopt the code, 10 cities adopting the code, and 1 major city adopting a stretch code, and having this done by the 2021. And you know, this would be a great progress from where we are today. So I think these are both achievable but aspirational at the same time. And then moving forward, having continuous improvement in the number of cities and states that can adopt the code, such that by 2050, the adoption of the model code would be by 100% of the states and cities, and that adoption of the stretch code would be by 40 major cities. On the enforcement side, as we know, enforcement is one of the more challenging aspects of building codes, and the goal is to have 50% verification of compliance with the adopted building energy code. So in those 5 states, 10 cities, and the 1 stretch code city, having at least 50% of the buildings in those jurisdictions verified to comply with the code in the short term. In the long term, going towards 100% out past 2030. And then the review and update is basically the same all the way through, which is essentially to have regular evaluation, looking at what the measures are, how energy efficiency is being delivered in the homes and buildings, and continually working to improve so that we can achieve the energy savings in the development phase. And with that, I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of the aspects of the roadmap, starting with the actual structure of the document itself. You'll see that the document has 4 major sections, and we've talked about sections 1 and 2 already, but in this current section of the webinar, we'll talk mostly about 3 and 4 in a little bit more detail on the 4 stages of the codes and standards, and then also the capacity building and communication. And inside of the codes and standards, we'll talk through some of the barriers, the actors, the actions, and then the available resources for each of those as we go through this section. So in the plan and development, the national model code for Mexico is the Energy Conservation Code, the IECC Mexico, developed by CONUEE, based on the International Code Council's IECC, with technical support from SENER and CONUEE and financial assistance from WRI and the United Kingdom. The IECC Mexico was issued in November of 2016 and comprises all energy efficiency standards related to buildings, both NOM and NMX, for the design, the building envelope, thermal insulation, mechanical systems, lighting systems, water heating. And the IECC Mexico also applies to both non-residential and residential buildings, and for new and existing buildings. It has the framework that, if adopted by local jurisdictions, it could affect the energy efficiency of all buildings in those jurisdictions. By 2015, CONUEE reported that the verification units had completed 171 compliance assessments in NOM 008 for the non-residential buildings and 361 compliance assessments for the residential buildings under NOM 020. So obviously the number of buildings that are being taken into the enforcement stage is very much dependent on the local jurisdictions and the amount of awareness within the verification units as well. Furthermore, in a country as large and diverse as Mexico, one-size-fits-all building energy codes developed through a single national model code does not deliver the most cost-effective energy savings in all cases. So instead, it's often important that proven advanced codes are available for leading jurisdictions and leading builders, and that core requirements are required in all of the other jurisdictions. So the stretch code is another significant opportunity in this plan and development stage, and stretch code is a version of the building energy code that has higher energy efficiency requirements than the base model code. One example could be a local government's commitment to achieve 10% additional energy savings over the national model code for a specific section of the code or the entire code. The benefits would be quite significant to Mexico in that leading jurisdictions could be proving the potential for how energy efficient buildings are developed and how the model code could continue to evolve in the years ahead. So because of that, what you'll see in the actual timeline is that you'll see a stretch code of 10%, and then what you'll see is that the next model code achieves 10%. And then once the stretch code achieves 20%, and then the model code would achieve 20%. This is a pattern that enables effective development of building energy codes and both the combination of the stretch and the model code to work together with each other. So what are the key messages? The key messages in terms of the plan and development is that building energy codes can be an effective channel to enable the enforcement of the standards on buildings, the NOMs, and that development of adequate building energy codes can ease the political burden of the local jurisdictions in bringing that energy efficiency to their citizens. Also, that minimum law building energy codes and standards developed in coordination with higher efficiency advanced stretch codes can improve the market for energy efficiency in buildings. And also that advanced stretch codes can be the basis for minimum law in ambitious jurisdictions, either for base law or even potentially for above code incentives and performance programs. So in terms of key actions, the roadmap identified 8 key actions under the plan and development. The 3 key ones include that there is a need for a truly collaborative effort with all stakeholders in the codes and standards development process, and that the process be made transparent, and that consultation is inclusive of all the stakeholders in both the public and the private sector, and that there would be strong leadership from CONUEE in this process, as they've been leading a lot of the standards work, of course, to date. The second key one is that design data collection strategies it's important to design these collection strategies to inform future building energy codes and standards. So regular monitoring and evaluating the impact of the building energy codes and standards enable greater support from the policymakers if they can understand what the benefits are, and can help them understand the benefits for their local jurisdiction as well. Also, the third one is that to ensure sufficient capacity and funding for the development of building energy codes and standards, so actually funding the policy process. Now, in the adoption and adaptation, after the building codes have been developed, the key step is to actually have it adopted by a local jurisdiction. And oftentimes that means adapting the code to local requirements or local political needs. And this could include things including building techniques or available technologies. Ideally, there would be very minimal adaptation, as it's helpful to having local jurisdictions harmonized with each other. This enables greater connectivity of the entire energy efficiency market in buildings. The political constitution of Mexico established the distribution of local government functions, where local governments have the authority over land use planning and building its activities, while the federal metrology and standardization law allows the federal government to mandate the creation of energy efficiency standards in all sectors. At the same time, the political constitution of Mexico empowers the local governments to design and approve regulations needed to execute their duties and functions, which means that municipalities design their own building regulations. And as Mexico has more than 2,400 municipalities, currently with approximately 170 building codes, the enforcement and updating of these laws becomes a challenge, as there's a wide diversity of laws, rules, and standards nationwide. To date, we see that there are 2 cities and 1 state that have adopted the building energy codes. However, we know that there is work in progress in another 2 or 3 cities as well, and states. And we're hoping that this will continue into the future. And of course, going back to the targets and timeline, what we see is that there's a goal that there would be 15 or 16 jurisdictions by 2021 that have adopted one form of a building energy code, as opposed to just the building codes that are currently more commonly in place. So what are the key messages for adoption and adaptation? Fundamentally, it's greater adoption of the building energy codes and standards by the local governments is needed, and that the federal government needs to raise awareness of the benefits of energy efficiency in the buildings, and that capacity building can be done to help improve these. For the key actions, the roadmap has identified 9 key actions, and we see that the main ones include that the local governments should adopt the building energy code, either based on the model code or based on a future advanced stretch code. Inclusion of energy performance requirements in the public procurement at all levels. This can help influence reducing the costs of energy efficient technologies for buildings and improve the compliance of building energy codes. And to increase the adoption levels of codes at the local level, the federal government should consider recognizing or rewarding the local governments that successfully adopt and enforce the building energy code in their public buildings and in new buildings. Federal governments can design funding mechanisms to promote state and local level adoption of the model code and the standards. Also, that building the capacity amongst the government staff that are responsible for the verification and enforcement of the building energy codes is critical. And share case studies amongst the local governments so that lessons learned can be shared and best practices can be delivered to the next local government that is adopting the building code. So the next stage, of course, is enforcement and certification. So once the building code is developed, adopted, the next critical step is actually enforcing it. This step involves the participation of qualified experts in building energy analysis, inspection, and enforcement across the country. Training and capacity building of these certified professionals is critical to a successful enforcement of the code. These certified professionals can either be government employees, they could be based on in a single jurisdiction, or they could be third-party organizations that can work across multiple jurisdictions. Local governments need to review and modify the process related to the issuance of construction permits and authorization. These are points in which enforcement of the building energy codes takes place. The administrative manuals that describe the process of the licensing office need to reflect all the changes arising from the new building regulations to enable it to be fulfilled under the construction requirements. So as an example, as an occupancy permit is put in place, if the building complies with the building code, that occupancy permit could be issued. To improve future enforcement of building energy codes, it's important to establish a set of indicators during the enforcement stage that can be used to regularly evaluate the compliance of the code. These indicators, as well as data to calculate these indicators, is already indicated from the verification units and should cover both quantitative and qualitative data collection, such as the building size, the use, and the energy efficiency levels. So in short, the idea is that the verification would continue to increase, that the number of buildings that are being built in jurisdictions that have building energy codes would increase to 100% verification by 2050. So the key messages include that once the code is adopted, the most important step to ensure the successful application of the enforcement is through the checkpoint procedures, both in the construction permits and the occupancy permits. Also, that local governments can lead by example by enforcing the building energy codes and standards in the public buildings, as well as support local projects that are complying with the codes. For the key actions, the idea is that ensure that the checkpoint procedures, as mentioned in the key messages, ensure that checkpoint procedures are created to require code compliance before the builders are able to obtain the construction permits, before the building owners obtain the occupancy permits. Ensure that the checkpoint procedures are created to require code compliance as well. Provide legal assistance to state and municipal governments. Promote effective third-party mechanisms to support local governments in monitoring and verifying building energy code compliance through the verification units. And enable penalties for non-compliance or other violations. So the fourth step is the review and update, and this is the evaluation stage where we look to see how well the codes are doing and how we can improve them cost effectively for the citizens. While getting an efficient building energy code enforced in the market is the main goal, it cannot stop there. Regular review and update is essential to trigger the market to become highly efficient. It's recommended to update the building energy code every 3 years to enable gradual shifts. Now that does not necessarily mean that the local jurisdiction is updating their requirements every 3 years, but that they have the ability to adopt something that has been developed and continually improved. So, and according to the federal law on standardization and metrology, all mandatory standards should be reviewed every 5 years. So this is what could help trigger the improvements in the norms and improvement in the actual requirements of the building code. You'll see the timeline for the short, medium, and long term is to have a continuous set of evaluations. So the key messages are that the effectiveness of the building energy codes and standards can be greatly improved with a regular review and update, and that codes and standards should be aligned with best practices and allow the construction industry to continuously innovate and progress to higher efficiency. The roadmap identified 7 key actions for review and update. The key ones include ensuring sufficient resources for this evaluation, ensuring reports provided by the verification units contains relevant information to improve the evaluation, get consensus between developers and builders in stretching the building energy code to have a higher efficiency option, and to update codes and standards according to energy efficient products and systems that are already in the market, and exploring harmonization with other international standards. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to David to go through the capacity building and communication.
Thank you, Brian. So as mentioned before, the core step to ensure that this roadmap is successfully implemented is capacity building, information and communication. That's very clear. And the first step, I would say, is formal education and training to enable effective decision-making, implementation, and enforcement of the model code and standards. Currently, the building industry is very disaggregated, with many small decisions being done in parallel that can add up to significant energy use. Training and certification of qualified professionals is essential to ensure well-implemented building energy code enforcement and ensure the correct installation of energy-efficient equipment. High-level education is also important to ensure that human resources and technical capacity is available to address the growing market demand for energy efficiency and space cooling. For example, the correct sizing and installation of energy efficient air conditioners is essential to ensure that they deliver optimal performance and expected energy savings, and customers need to be sensitized on their optimal operation. So a lot of behavior part there. Secondly, collaboration with the Ministry of Public Education, SEP, universities, technical colleges, research institutes, and ensuring regular training events are critical to build this capacity. Education and school programs on energy efficiency could also prove to be a valuable mechanism to deliver energy efficiency best practices to households. Thirdly, for professionals in the building sector, SEP coordinates the National Council for Standardization and Certification of Labor Competences, CONUEE, and it has 9 labor competences related to energy efficiency and renewable energy, as well as the Energy Advisor for Housing Standard. Furthermore, FIDE is the certification entity for labor competences on energy efficiency and renewable energy. Finally, regular public information and communication on energy efficiency in buildings is essential to increase awareness of consumers and influence their decision making. In terms of targets there, just to recap, from 2021 to 2030, we'd be looking mainly to fast track the building energy codes and standards, so the training that would be needed would be focusing on cities and builders on building energy codes, energy labeling, and starting to pilot some net zero emission buildings. And I understand that there's already a couple of cities that are investing in net zero emission buildings. From 2030 to 2050, so that over a 20-year period, this would be slightly different, and we're hoping that by 2030 there'd be significant progress on adopting the building energy codes and enforcing them. And so we'd be looking at training cities and buildings on moving already to net zero emission buildings, trying to update their advanced stretch codes as well so that they can move at different paces, and also to look at energy efficiency and renewable integration and other options. So it's well more advanced area there. So in terms of the key messages and key actions that were identified, the key messages are particularly capacity building and training, seen as critical for the success of the roadmap and implementation of building energy codes. Capacity building needs to be incorporated at all stages of the roadmap, and particularly at local level on a regular basis. And it's important to collaborate with key stakeholders, including universities, engineering and architect associations, technical colleges, and many others. In terms of information, communication, and awareness, it's a key component of the roadmap and will be instrumental in ensuring greater adoption and enforcement of building energy codes at local level. Again, as I mentioned before, continuous and regular communication can help achieve the targets proposed in the roadmap, combined with training and capacity building. In terms of the key actions, for capacity building, a total of 8 actions were identified, and for communication, a total of 11 actions, of which we've highlighted some below. The first one, to develop professional standards, training programs, and certification schemes for installers and builders for installation of efficient technologies for thermal insulation. Develop a strategy with common training tools and resources, including an online portal for local governments. To develop a strong national communication plan for information and awareness on energy efficiency in buildings, to provide states and municipalities with necessary knowledge and tools for implementation of energy efficiency in municipalities. And there's definitely many opportunities there to work with the communication teams from SENER, CONUEE, as well as with the municipalities and the municipal associations. Using best practices and pilot projects to build local capacity to highlight the benefits over their life cycle is also very important. And finally, develop fact sheets displaying the benefits for complying with the building energy codes and standards for manufacturers and material and equipment providers. So moving on to the final, one of our final slides is the next steps. And before we move on to the Q&A, developing the roadmap was definitely the easy part now, and we really need your help to disseminate and implement these actions that are proposed. So it will require a joint effort from all of us to be effective, and therefore we would like to call on the mobilization of all the key stakeholders, and we again request your support to disseminate and implement this roadmap. Before we move to the Q&A and I pass on to my colleague Anna, I'd like to remind everyone that the roadmap document and the summary are available online in English and Spanish on SENER's and CONUE's website. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll pass on to Anna.
Thank you very much, David and Brian, for such interesting presentation. We now have the Q&A session. We got about 10 minutes, more or less. Recuerden que pueden hacer sus preguntas usando el panel de preguntas. Simplemente, por favor, ingrese su pregunta en inglés o español y haga clic en enviar. Okay, Brian and David, we already have 2 questions. One question is about, in your experience in other countries, which could be the main challenge to face in order to have successful implementation of this code, of the roadmap?
Thanks, Anna. That's a good question. We actually find that the enforcement and verification is usually the largest challenge in terms of a step. And that's primarily due to local jurisdiction budget constraints. However, what we found is that in the more successful countries and jurisdictions, that a combination of local staff being trained up to do verification and also third-party verifiers like verification units can significantly improve the enforcement and also lower the enforcement costs instead of having that entire burden be on the local jurisdiction. So if third-party verification, the verification units are capable of verifying across all jurisdictions in Mexico, that would really streamline the process significantly.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have another question. If you have economical resources available, in which action or actions would you invest?
So I think we'd be looking at investing in policy. So as shown in the target timeline that Brian talked about, investing in priority actions and parallel activities would be very important. So if I had some resource available, I would invest in first trying to get local governments interested in energy efficiency and its multiple benefits, showing that it can contribute to social and economic development, and focus that effort mainly on the large cities of each state. And I think if we can progress with those cities and make some progress there, then it will have a sort of trickle effect. Then secondly, I'd try to help some of these cities in the process of adoption of building energy codes, and as we know, it's already being done in several with the support of the Danish Energy Agency, GIZ, WRI, and others. And I think that's an important process to continue and expand to other cities. Then thirdly, if we get on to a good start, I'd start working with these local governments on optimizing the enforcement together with the federal government. And then finally, I think, or in parallel, depending on how quickly the states and cities are moving, start to regularly update the building energy codes and standards. So we're having the advanced stretch codes, so we start moving the market, and like that, the states that want to move quicker can do so. And I think so those 4 points are the main ones. And I think we've got a couple of other questions. I think the first, we've got several questions. We're going to try to answer as many as possible. We have a question on, have the municipalities been involved in the roadmap and the development of norms? So in terms of the roadmap, we try to involve as many as possible. Of course, there's 2,400 municipalities, and as Brian mentioned, and so we definitely had Tabasco, Mexico City, Merida, Morelos, states and cities involved, as well as a couple of the municipal associations. And in terms of the NOM development, when CONUEE does it, it's a nationwide consultation, so anybody can participate in the development of those norms and provide feedback. And so I imagine many municipalities have been participating in that process, or if they haven't, I really recommend that they do get involved and get familiar with the norms that are being developed. We've got another question which I'll pass on to Brian.
So the question is, the building materials manufacturers want to help take this forward, and what should they do? And what we often find is that if building manufacturers, whether it's material manufacturers, technology manufacturers, if they can become advocates for energy efficiency, showing that energy efficient technologies are in the market, showing that they're cost effective, they should be involved with the building code development process to make sure that those technologies are included in essentially achieving the energy efficiency. And we do find that globally, that the building manufacturers are actually often there protecting us as citizens to get the cost-effective energy efficiency into the code. So I think it's great if they can be involved as a stakeholder in the process. Also on the local adoption, it's also important too, not just at the development of the code, but also on the local adoption. There was a second question on addressing poverty through the Building Energy Code, and of course what we find is that building energy codes help reduce energy poverty, meaning that the percentage of someone's budget that's spent on energy, and we often find in many markets that a large portion of lower income, a large portion of their income is actually spent on energy. So the building energy codes actually go to protect them, and having technologies such as better insulation or better equipment or better windows that can ensure lower monthly costs or higher resilience to extreme outdoor temperatures, these will all go towards reducing energy poverty. I'll take one more here as well that was on water heating. So yeah, water heating is a big component, and it's one that we see that will continue to rise a bit. There is NOM 003. Also, the Mexico Conservation Code does include water heating as a component as well. So what we see is, continue to update these standards, make sure that the local jurisdictions are able to enforce having improved water heating equipment in the buildings as well. So just like any other technology, I would say water heating is an important one, but just make sure that it's part of the process.
I think in terms of, I've got a question here of which are the cities, states that have adopted the building energy codes and standards so far, and I think Brian mentioned this during the presentation, so only Xalapa and Veracruz Municipality and Veracruz State have adopted building energy codes and standards, so they're the ones that are more advanced. However, Mexicali and Guadalajara are in the process of adapting their code. The other question there was on net zero emission buildings. Is there any example in Mexico? I recently saw a news article just 2-3 months ago of a commercial building that's being done, I think in Mexicali, that is in current sort of design phase, of course. So if you search for Mexicali or building energy efficient building or net zero emission building in Mexico, I'm sure you'd be able to find this.
Okay, let me take a few more here. So one is on verification units certifying or verifying buildings, and so what we think, ideally, the verification units could do it across the entire country. However, we find in many other countries, the local jurisdictions oftentimes have their own authorization process. So I'm not sure if Mexico can get around that or not, but ideally, the verification units, these third-party organizations could be authorized. And additional up-and-coming third-party verification units that are maybe certified either at the national level or at the state or local level could be brought in to actually verify the code. Also, there's a question on should the codes be adopted at different times based on residential sector and commercial sector. And generally I would say no. I think it's important that there are different requirements for residential buildings, commercial buildings, but I think it's important to have a continuous process that incorporates both new and existing buildings and residential and commercial in each cycle. There's one other question about who is doing the advanced stretch codes, and I know that there's a number of them, but one of the more effective ones that I've seen is the state of Massachusetts in the United States, and they've used it both for the state level and local level requirements, and they allow for differentiation based on a base code and an advanced stretch code. So I think looking at Massachusetts would be interesting.
And then I think we're reaching our time, but I'll answer another two questions. One question is what's stopping the municipalities from adopting the building energy codes and standards? Well, I suggest you have a look at the roadmap because we've listed the barriers very clearly there. So that would be my recommendation. If anybody wants to understand why it's not happening, it's described in the roadmap, and of course we then try to link it particularly with the actions that are required and which are the stakeholders that need to be involved, and also what are the tools that are available to help people adopt the building energy codes and standards. Also to clarify that the roadmap, when it was developed till today, of course, the roadmap is focusing on both new and existing buildings, and so trying to tackle and address energy efficiency and to deliver energy efficiency improvements in new and existing buildings. So just to make that clear. I think I know we've got several more questions, but I think we'll struggle to answer all of them, and some of them are very, very specific in detail, so it would almost warrant another webinar. So I'll pass on to my colleague Anna to just do some of the closing remarks. Again, thank you everybody for their attention, and hopefully you can support SENER, CONUEE, and other stakeholders in the adoption and enforcement of the building energy codes and helping us with this roadmap in the short and long term. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Brian. Unfortunately, we run out of time. Les agradecemos a todos su atención y participación en el webinar de hoy. La presentación estará disponible, como ya les comentamos, a finales de esta semana en el canal de YouTube. También les enviaremos un correo con la presentación del día de hoy. Para nosotros ha sido un placer llevar a cabo este webinar que esperamos lo haya encontrado útil y relevante. También agradecemos a SENER por todo su apoyo y ayuda para organizar estos webinars. Seguiremos organizando otros webinars de eficiencia energética. La siguiente sesión podría estar enfocada en una de las publicaciones más relevantes de la AIE, el Energy Technology Perspective de 2017. Aún no tenemos la fecha definida, pero los mantendremos informados y no duden en ponerse en contacto con nosotros si tienen alguna pregunta. Con ello, les agradecemos nuevamente su asistencia y nos veremos en la siguiente sesión de la serie de webinars de eficiencia energética entre la Agencia Internacional de Energía y la Secretaría de Energía en México. Bonito día a todos.